Why were Paul and Silas thrown in prison at Philippi? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 16, verses 11 to 24. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 16, verse 11. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 16, beginning at verse 11. Therefore, sailing from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace. And the next day we came to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the foremost city of that part of Macedonia, a colony. And we were staying in that city for some days. And on the Sabbath day we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily made. And we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshipped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she persuaded us. Now it happened, as we went to prayer, that a certain slave girl possessed with the spirit of divination met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune-telling. This girl followed Paul and us, and cried out, saying, These men are of the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation. And this she did for many days. But Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he came out of her that very hour. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And they brought them to the magistrates and said, These men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city, and they teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe. Then the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. And when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. In our last lesson, we had Paul ending up in Troas, which is in northwestern Turkey today. He sees a vision of a man in Macedonia pleading for Paul to come and help them. So in verse 11, we have Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and Luke sailing from Troas towards Macedonia. On this journey, they made a short stop in Samothrace, a small island in the Aegean Sea, before coming to Neapolis on the coast. Let's remember, when Paul sailed, he did so on merchant ships, for he didn't have a ship of his own. So some of those stops were made, and the travel schedule he kept were made because that's where these ships stopped. Neapolis is the coastal town, but not where Paul was going, for he traveled about 16 kilometers or 10 miles northwest to the city of Philippi. The city formerly had been known as Dathos, but was repaired and adorned by Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, and after him it was called Philippi. It was famous for having been the place where several battles were fought during the civil wars of the Romans, and among others, for the decisive battle between Brutus and Antony. It was at this place Brutus killed himself. At the time of Paul, Philippi is a major city in the area and one of wealth, as we see in this chapter. Normally, when Paul enters a city, he goes on the Sabbath to the synagogue and teaches among the Jews. Here in Philippi, there doesn't seem to be a synagogue, so Paul goes out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily done, and sat down with the women who met there, and then spoke to them. Where the men were, we do not know, but perhaps a lack of faithful men at that time in Philippi was a reason there wasn't a synagogue there. Among these women was a woman named Lydia, who was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, a city in Asia Minor, in what we call Turkey today. Later, Thyatira would have a church in it, for the city was one of the 7 churches of Asia addressed in the book of Revelation. Being a seller of purple meant that Lydia would have been a woman of wealth, for purple was a most valuable color worn by princes and the rich. Now often we think that wealthy people wouldn't hear the gospel, And while wealth can sometimes get in the way, making generalizations like this will get us into trouble and would exclude many listeners of this podcast in North America from being saved, as even the poor middle class among us are wealthy compared to the impoverished in other places around the world. Lydia's wealth, though, didn't close her heart to the gospel. In fact, the message of the gospel opened her heart. Verse 14 says that the Lord opened her heart to the gospel. Some think this means that the Lord did something miraculously here, or this shows some sort of unconditional election. But I ask the question, how did the Lord open her heart? Through the preaching of the gospel. Paul will say in Romans 10:17 that is how we come to faith. It's not a miracle, it's the gospel. When she heard the gospel, she believed and was baptized along with her household. Think about that for a moment. It was only the women who came to pray, yet Lydia's example convinced others in her household to hear the gospel and to obey it. In being the hospitable woman that she was, she even persuaded Paul and his companies to stay with her while they were in Philippi. All of this because the gospel was preached on the riverside among the women. Coming to verse 16, we find Paul still in Philippi, but the setting has changed. On the way to prayers, Paul and company were met by a slave girl possessed by a spirit of divination. A spirit of divination means that she was a fortune teller. Now, I don't believe that this woman, who was possessed by a demon, could actually tell the future. For scriptures say only God can know the future. The devil can't. But demons can deceive people all the time, just like the devil deceived Eve in Genesis 3. This woman was a fraud, but she also was a slave, meaning that what she did was bring her masters a lot of money. The girl, when meeting Paul, proclaimed that Paul and his company were servants of the Most High God, who proclaimed to us the way of salvation. In this she told the truth. The words were coming from a liar, which is why Paul had to do something about it. Annoyed, Paul turned to the girl and commanded the spirit in the name of Jesus to come out of her. And the spirit obeyed, just like the unclean spirits obeyed Jesus in the Gospels. This teaches us a lesson. The messenger matters. If someone is a known liar, we don't want them to be our spokesman unless their reputation changes, for it will hurt our cause. If this girl wanted to become a Christian and proclaim who Paul was, she'd first have to have this unclean spirit removed and quit being a fortune teller and a fraud. Same is true today. Anybody can become a Christian, but they must first give up sin. Now, seeing their source of income having disappeared, the masters of this girl seized Paul and Silas and dragged them to the authorities. They told the magistrates that these Jews troubled the city, teaching customs that was not lawful for Romans to receive or observe. Now this, of course, was preposterous, for the Roman Empire worshipped many gods, and the persecution of Christians by Rome hadn't begun yet. So how could Paul's message be unlawful? If these people had told the truth that Paul had cast out a demon from their slave who was committing fraud, then they'd go to jail. So fabricating charges against Paul and Silas shouldn't be surprising. The behavior of the magistrates to this charge also might give us some insight as to why there was no synagogue in Philippi. For without further investigation, Paul and Silas were beaten with rods and thrown into prison. Racism existed even in the Roman world, and so Paul and Silas were unjustly imprisoned here, and the jailer told to keep them securely. What happened next was nothing short of amazing, and shows us the true power of the gospel. Please come back for our next lesson, where we will discuss that. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 16, verses 25 to 34, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.